How's it going, guys? My name is Zach with The Movie Castle, and today we're going to be talking about Masters of Horror, Season 1, Episode 8, John Carpenter's Cigarette Burns. This is, of course, directed by John Carpenter, as evident from the title. You know how John Carpenter has his titles where his name is the first thing, comma S, and then the title. But anyway, directed by John Carpenter, starring Norman Reedus, and even though this is the 8th episode, if you look at the complete season DVD, they list it as number 1, and it's the first episode you see when you put the disc in. That's because this is quite easily the best episode of Masters of Horror, and I'm glad to cover it. I rewatched it for this review, and it really just sucked me in, and I definitely, before we even get into the finer points, definitely recommend you watch this. If you're a John Carpenter fan and you like his movies like In the Mouth of Madness, which is a really underrated Carpenter, you'll probably really like this. Now, it's not as good as John Carpenter's best classic films, but this is a really good one. And because it's TV, it kind of gets forgotten about when you talk about Carpenter, but it's pretty dang good. And definitely the best episode of the show. Plus, you also have Norman Reedus. If you watch Walking Dead, you know him as Daryl. And interestingly enough, Greg Nicotero, who would later be one of the big guys on Walking Dead, was actually doing makeup in this show, so they may have they met here before starting Walking Dead, which is pretty cool. Anyway, I guess without further ado, let's just go ahead and talk a bit about the plot. Now, I'm not going to do any major spoilers, but like I always say, I do want to say my piece on some plot points, and I do want to make sure you guys have a basic understanding as to what this episode is about. So let's jump right in. Norman Reedus is a big film buff in this. He has his own theater, and he has a special talent. He can track down rare film-related items, be them movie props or, more like what we're looking at right now, rare copies of rare films, the super obscure stuff. So that's how he makes his money. He has his theater, which isn't doing great, but he also has his business of tracking down rare films, which is pretty darn cool. You get this guy, he's a rich film buff. He has a collection of over 8,000 movies, and he is looking for a movie that will strike him. He's looking for the ultimate moving horror film, and he's actually dying, and before he dies, he wants to see this legendary film. It's a French film, La Fin Absolute de Monde, or in English, The Absolute End of the World. And this film is legendary. It was only screened once at a film festival in France. There, once the movie started going, rioting broke out, bloody rioting, and several people were killed, leading to the film being banned. When the director tried to leave France, it was confiscated at the border and supposedly destroyed. Now, supposedly that was his work print, and there was only one copy, so that means this film should be 100% lost, but of course, there are rumors that there was either a second copy, or they didn't really destroy the first one. Everybody thinks maybe, just maybe, it's out there somewhere, and this guy wants to hire Norman Reedus to track it down. Norman Reedus goes, I'll look, but it's gotta be gone, right? There's gotta be no way. Well, this guy says it is still in existence. He gives Norman Reedus a big, thick, folder full of literally every piece of data he could find on this movie, rumors of secret screenings and any article in any newspaper about it. And then he shows them on the wall, there's these big angel wings that are actually a prop from the movie that he's managed to track down and purchase. But Norman Reedus goes, nah, there's no way that this film still exists. And then the guy takes him to another room in his mansion and shows him proof that the movie exists. Now, what's in here is a pretty cool twist, and it's best to go in when you don't know what it's going to be. Just this visual, you're like, oh wow, that's something, but it's a pretty cool, shocking moment. But he does now have proof that at least one copy of this film exists somewhere, and he goes to track it down. Now, during this whole scene, he's looking around, he's going from place to place, following clues, and the legend of this thing begins to build up. He has to travel to France, he meets some guy at the film archive, and he hears all these stories. You know, he meets a film reviewer who actually saw the movie way back when, and he talks to them and they describe it, and you find out little bits and pieces about this thing. The reviewer said, oh, if anything, the riots were undersold. It was actually way worse than what you heard about. And then he goes on to say that he's, ever since he retired, has been trying his best to nail down the perfect review of this movie and perfectly describe what it was like, but he just can't quite describe it, which is crazy. And then there's rumors of like a private screening where, you know, the theater once again, you know, went into chaos, and it's this legend where you hear little bits and pieces about it. A lot of the cast and crew are all dead, and there's like one guy left and he's blind and will attack anyone who talks about it. And the director himself, they say, oh, there's no record of him dying, but the people who are in the know are like, that guy's dead. And you don't know, like, they all say that, but why is there no record of it? And there's all these little bits and pieces of mystery that slowly get piled on, and this is one heck of a build-up to this film, and that's really one of this episode's best strengths, is this idea of the film as a legend, and that is really, really cool. But in addition to this part with the film, you also get to find out about Norman Reedus in his personal life. This guy was married, and he owned his theater, and his wife and him, they had substance abuse problems, drug problems, and one day he goes in to the bathroom and find that his wife has unfortunately killed herself, and that, of course, is causing a lot of emotional trauma. But to add another layer to this, the theater that he owns, he actually bought on a loan from his wife's father. So this guy, the father of his wife, who's now dead and hates Norman Reedus, has to, you know, stick around because he's the guy who Norman Reedus owes all this money to. And in addition to the theater, you get Norman Reedus and his friend in the projection booth, and his friend has this fun hobby. He goes to the movies they show. In this case, they're actually showing Dario Argento's Deep Red, which is a pretty good movie, and kind of ironically, Argento would direct 2 episodes of Masters of Horror. But anyway, he's going into Deep Red, and he cuts out the cigarette burns from the film. Now, the cigarette burns, they are every now and then, if you see a movie that's actually on film, up in the corner there'll be a little dot. It's not literally a burn by a cigarette, or at least not in modern times, but it would be a cue to the projectionist that it was about time to change the reel, and the guy's collecting them because he says, if you see the cigarette burn, you know you're about at the end of the reel, and that's usually where something intense happens, and he's like, you take away the cigarette burn, you don't know when the intense scene is coming. Now, he hears this bit about cigarette burns, but as he's pursuing the movie, The Absolute End of the World, he starts to see cigarette burns in his real life, and things start to become surreal for him as he gets nearer and nearer to the movie, and of course, creepy things from his past start to show up and haunt him, which is all pretty cool. So let's go ahead and talk about the biggest pros. We already talked about how The Absolute End of the World as a movie has such a great build-up and a legend behind it, but I do also want to mention this movie is about the hunt for a rare film, and it really does have appeal to film nerds to hear a story that's about looking for a lost film. I mean, I'll go on YouTube and I'll watch videos about lost films, and you hear these stories, especially about the older ones, and how film preservation, people didn't care about it as much back then, and you know, all this work that has to go into restoration. And if you're a big film nerd, the idea that he's hunting down and going to find a lost film is just super, super cool. In addition to that, everybody wants this film because it's actually a scary movie that will affect you, and that you don't get to see too much of the actual film itself, but if you're paying attention, you can piece together what they did when they shot this movie and what's on the film. You can actually piece that together pretty early on, and it is a super duper messed up thing that will definitely get your movie cursed, even though it's not super spelled out for a long time. You can tell what they did. And this idea that there's a scary movie that's actually so scary, you know, that it'll drive you insane. Like, I remember when I first got into watching horror films, there was all this legend behind some of these movies. You know, The Exorcist or The Shining, they're so scary. There was, I remember with Child's Play, there was always the story that kids that were way too young would watch Child's Play and just get freaked out or go insane. And then when I finally watched it, I'm like, that's really not that bad. And then you'd hear things like, you know, when Saw came out, and there's all this build up to it, and you're like, how gross, how gory is that, you know, going into it. And then Paranormal Activity came out, and you'd start hear these people saying, it's the scariest thing ever, and they would get freaked out by their own houses, and of course it wasn't that scary. And, you know, being a horror fan and seeing so many horror films, you know, you don't get scared by the movies as much anymore, and you really have to have a pretty dang good one to, you know, to get you scared again. And the idea that there's some film that's the scariest thing ever that can really shake you is, again, if you're a film nerd, and a lot of the people that are showing up for Carpenter are, the idea that there's a film this deep and dark is a really interesting idea. The fact that, you know, it's something that someone who's seen 8,000 horror films, like this rich guy at the beginning, it's gonna get to him too. That idea is really cool for a horror fan. Now that being said, I do have one con with this episode. It's nothing major, but there's one scene towards the end where Norman Reedus tracks down this guy who's managed to get some props from the movie, and during this scene, it starts to try to turn into more of a standard horror movie, you know, get the thrills out for the people that aren't into cerebral horror. And to be honest, when I rewatched it, I was like, oh, I don't even remember this scene being here. You know, I just completely forgotten about this part. It's really just trying to give something to the people that don't appreciate the cerebral horror, this scene with that guy, and not the biggest fan of it. Plus it also tries to spell a few things out more than they should be. But yeah, the scene with the bald-headed guy that's got the props and photos, and the scene in the big warehouse, I just felt that was a little bit unnecessary. Now, that being said, it by no means ruins the movie. It's just not that great of a part. But that being said, doesn't ruin it. But it is worth mentioning that there's this one point where it tries to do more of a standard horror movie approach. But other than that, it's a pretty dang good movie. Now, it's not as good as, like, say, The Thing or something, but it's still a pretty dang good Carpenter. Better than a lot of his later stuff, and almost up there with the classics. And hey, given the fact that this is a TV show with not a huge budget, and it's pretty cool. It's easily the best episode. If you're a Carpenter fan, especially if you're a fan of In the Mouth of Madness, you need to check this out. Norman Reedus is also great, and overall, this is probably the best episode of the show. And I only say probably because I haven't seen them all, and there are some good episodes of this show too, but this is probably the best one. So if you only see one episode of the show, see this. If you're a Carpenter fan, check it out. If you're a Masters of Horror fan, somehow haven't seen this episode yet, I really have to say you need to go watch this. This is pretty fun. John Carpenter, Norman Reedus, lots of stuff for movie nerds, especially horror movie nerds. A big, fun legend around the scariest movie of all time. It's pretty fun. It sucked me in, and I do have to highly recommend this. But anyway, I guess that's about all I have to say on this for right now. So that being said, to everyone who's watched so far, thank you for watching. To everyone who's liked and subscribed, thank you. You really are helping the channel out. I'll go ahead and leave a relevant playlist down here if you want to see more videos. I've actually recorded over 300 videos here, so I'm sure I'll have more if you like. I do primarily horror movies, like 95% horror movies, so if that sounds like something you're interested in, I'd recommend sticking around. Anyway, have a good day. I'll see you guys again very, very soon. Relevant playlist on the bottom. Have a good day.